Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee. We're still in Unit 9, and in this video we'll be discussing social influence. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify the contributions of several key researchers in the areas of conformity, compliance, and obedience, including Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, and Philip Zimbardo. You should also be able to explain how individuals respond to the expectations of others, including groupthink, conformity, and obedience to authority. You should be able to describe the structure and function of different kinds of group behavior. You should be able to predict the impact of the presence of others on individual behavior. And within this category, you're going to be exposed to several different terms: bystander effect, social facilitation, social inhibition, group polarization, de-individuation, diffusion of responsibility, in-group out-group bias, reciprocity norms, social traps, prisoner's dilemma, conflict resolution, and subordinate goals. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. So have you ever wondered how the actions of others shape the way we as individuals think and behave? This is known as social influence. Basically, we all have social roles. These are socially defined patterns of behaviors that are expected of groups in a given setting or group. So we basically take on these different roles depending on the setting or group that we're in. The roles you assume could result from your interests, your abilities, your goals, or they could be imposed on you by the group or by cultural, economic, or biological conditions that are beyond your control. In any case, social roles do prescribe your behavior by making obvious what you should do, how you should do it, and when you should do it. Much research has been done by Philip Zimbardo in this area of social roles. And if you'll think back to our previous video, he was able to determine that our behavior does change when we are in a group whose behavior is different than our own, even if it is not within our own value system. For example, the prisoners and the guards acted very differently than their personalities might have led you to believe otherwise outside of the study. Social norms are a group's expectations regarding what is appropriate and acceptable for its members' attitudes and behaviors. There can be very broad guidelines like political or religious views and policies, or very specific like how you are supposed to be quiet in a library. This can also help guide the conversation. So basically, what is acceptable to discuss? It can define your dress code, like for example, in most offices you wear business attire, not t-shirts and shorts, or it can be unwritten rules built into various situations, like when a teacher is lecturing, students are supposed to listen and not talk at the same time. Social norms are basically our guidelines for how to behave in society. So let's talk about conformity and obedience. Basically, behavior is contagious and it's modeled by one, followed by another. We follow the behavior of others to conform. So we're going to talk about these three similar but different concepts: conformity, compliance, and obedience. There is a phenomenon known as the chameleon effect. In other words, conformity is adjusting one's behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard, so you want to blend in, and this may not be on a conscious level. A famous study conducted by Solomon Asch, known as the line study, he set out to test the levels of conformity in individuals, and what he did, he put participants in a room with 9 other pseudo-participants. So there were actual participants and Confederates, or people who were in on it. And those pseudo-participants all answered incorrectly. The participant was then given the same question. The question was, which line matched this original line? So given the choices of A, B, or C, the obvious choice is C. However, the results were that about a third of trial participants regularly conformed to the unanimous but erroneous group answer, with an average of about 75% of all participants conforming at least once throughout the experiment. So even though it was very, very obvious that the lines that they were saying were not the same length, the participants stated that they were because all the other ones did, even if they were wrong. They didn't want to not conform. There are some conditions that influence conformity. The size of the group matters. The more the people, the more likely one is to conform. Basically, 3 or more people is considered to be about the size where conformity increases. The status of the group. The lower a person's status in a group, the more likely they are to conform. So if they're new, if they are a lower level employee, an undergrad versus a graduate student, or a lower classman versus an upperclassman, they're more likely to conform. Observation of the group: if a decision is made in private and anonymously, people are less likely to conform. And in a unanimous group, the conformity is greater when all in the group agree. So in Solomon Ash's study, even if a couple of people had said, no, it's not that answer, that doesn't look right at all, the participants would have been less likely to conform. There are reasons for conformity. There's a normative social influence. People want to avoid rejection, or they want to gain social approval, so we respect the norms of the group. There's also this concept of informative social influence due to the fact that the group may provide valuable information or other resources. We want to accept the opinions of others, especially when concerning tough decisions. We don't want to stand alone in tough decisions. So in groups where we want to be socially accepted, or where we want to get the opinions of others based on money or where to go to college, we are more likely to kind of conform to what other people think so that you can get that information. Compliance is a little bit different. This is adjusting one's behavior because of an explicit or implicit request. Explicit is a direct request, implicit is indirect. Indirect requests could include asking for or implying something else. And this can be used by salespeople and politicians very easily and very effectively. Obedience is a change in behavior in response to the command of someone in a position of authority. There is a power differential there. All right, let's talk about Milgram's shock experiment. This is another very famous study conducted by Stanley Milgram, and what he did was he designed a study that investigated the effects of authority on obedience. And this was around the same time as the Nuremberg trials. If you are familiar with history, you know what that means. Basically, the people who were being accused of being Nazis in the Holocaust were being brought to trial in the Nuremberg trials. And psychology often reflects like a mirror what's going on in society. Psychologists didn't understand how people could conform and comply and be obedient to these horrifying requests that were increasingly shocking and inconceivable. So what he did was he set up this experiment where people were brought in and asked to participate in a study on learning. So again, you had a participant, a real participant who was the teacher, and you had a pseudo participant or a confederate who was the learner. So the learner was in on it. The learner went into a different room and was tasked with trying to remember certain words that the teacher was going to call out. If they got it right, they moved on. If they got it wrong, the participant or the teacher was to give a shock, and it was supposed to continually go up each time the participant got it wrong, or the learner. Well, the learner wasn't really getting shocked, but they really made it out like they were. And so the participant really believed that the learner was getting shocked, okay? The teacher thought the learner was getting shocked every time they got it wrong. They were calling out, they were increasing the volts that were being given to the learner. Pseudo, this wasn't really happening, but they thought that it was. It's very easy for us to sit back and say, I wouldn't have done that. Very easy. However, the results were that 65% of the participants obeyed all the way up to 450 volts. That is a lethal dose of electricity, simply because some guy in a white lab coat told him to do so. There were many variations. Milgram replicated this study several times using different things. When it was on a university campus, there was more of a sense of credibility, so the likelihood of the participants obeying increased. If they were wearing a lab coat, the obedience increased, versus when they were in just like an office building or the person was just in like business attire. So all of these things play into our obedience. When asked why, because Stanley Milgram did go back and debrief the participants, when they were asked why they obeyed, most rationalized their obedience was because they felt the experimenter was ultimately responsible for what happened to the other participant. So there are some other influences on obedience as well. Prestige, I kind of covered that a little bit about the authority figure. If they are seen as having a higher level of their prestigious professors, they're harder to disobey. The presence of others who disobey. So if you see other people doing that thing that you're being asked to do, it's harder to disobey. And then it really ultimately comes down to the person. There were people who refused to comply. There were people who refused to even give the first shock. And so there is a personal characteristic, internal thing going on that affects someone's willingness to obey. Social dilemmas are situations in which selfish behavior that benefits individuals in the short run may spell disaster for an entire group in the long run, or this is also sometimes called a social trap. In class, we did an activity where I asked you in a poll about some bonus points. If you may remember, what do you think the outcome is? And why did you pick the point value that you did? Think about that. This is basically the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, two people are separated immediately after being arrested for a serious crime. The district attorney believes they're guilty but lacks evidence. So they're kind of forced to try to get something out of them. Each can either confess or not confess. The DA tells them if both refuse to confess, each will be convicted of a minor offense and jailed for 1 year. If both confess, the DA will recommend a 5-year sentence. If one remains silent and one confesses, the DA will allow the confessing prisoner to go free, whereas the other will serve the maximum 10-year sentence. So this is a real dilemma. What do you do? The best outcome is if they both compromised, but is that going to happen? Usually not. Usually someone's going to roll over on someone. That's what they say. Let's talk about behavior in the presence of others. There are a couple of different ways that this could go. One is social facilitation. This refers to improved performance on a task in the presence of others. So other people are there, so you perform better. This usually occurs with either simple or well-learned tasks, but not difficult or not yet to be mastered tasks. So you have to pretty much know what you're doing in order for social facilitation to really be effective. Social inhibition, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's a negative influence of others, which leads to a decrease in performance. And this is because there's a perception by the performer that the crowd or someone else is evaluating or judging them. There is also a phenomenon known as social loafing. This is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort than when working individually. Why do people do that? You guys know what I'm talking about. You're working on a group project and there's always someone, it seems, that doesn't want to do their part. Well, because people feel less accountable when they're in a group. They may view their contribution as either dispensable or not important. Maybe their work isn't going to be as valuable, and so social loafing happens. There's also de-individuation. This is kind of like a mob mentality. This is where you lose your self-awareness and self-restraint when you're in a group situation that fosters arousal and anonymity. So you're in a huge group, you do things that you wouldn't normally do if you could be easily identified. When you're in a mob, no one can point you out. So again, you feel less accountable for your individual actions. There is this concept of group polarization. This is when the group's prevailing attitudes are enhanced through discussion. What you already think is strengthened through the discussion by a group of like-minded people. If the group is like-minded, discussion strengthens its prevailing opinions and attitudes. This can be beneficial or harmful. The bottom line, you usually leave more fired up one way or the other than when you first arrived, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Groupthink is a way of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in decision-making overrides the possible alternatives. Basically, you don't want to make waves, so you go along with the rest of the group's decisions or the decision of the most vocal members because you just don't want to go there. And that is it for social influence. In our next video, we'll be talking about antisocial relations. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.